Every loaf of bread he kneaded was a silent conversation with a man who was no longer there. In the early hours, as the city slept, Julian moved with a somber, practiced grace. His hands, dusted with flour like a winter's first snow, worked the dough, but his mind was 100 years away, back in the warmth of his grandfather's arms. The scent of yeast and tradition filled the small, quiet space, a scent that was both a comfort and a crushing weight. The world outside had changed, but inside, these walls, time was a stubborn, unmoving thing. The old oven, a beast of brick and iron, stood sentinel, its heat a familiar low hum against the city's growing noise. Before we begin, let me ask you, have you ever carried a promise so heavy it felt like it was breaking your back? If stories about the silent battles we fight speak to you, subscribe and don't miss what's coming. Julian's grandfather had called this bakery a sanctuary, a place where time slowed down and the simple art of good. Bread could heal a weary soul. Now, it felt more like a tomb, a museum dedicated to a forgotten craft. The storefront window, once a beacon of warm light, now looked out onto a world of sleek, impersonal coffee shops and fast food chains. Their bright, sterile lights felt like a judgment, a constant reminder that his grandfather's legacy, his life's work, was becoming a relic, an anachronism in a world that craved speed over substance. He remembered the promise, whispered on a quiet afternoon with the smell of old paper and baked bread in the air. Don't ever let the art die, Julian. It's not about the money, it's about the soul you pour into the dough. That promise was the air he breathed, the reason he woke up before the sun. But the air was getting thin, and the weight of it was suffocating. Every unsold loaf, every quiet day, was a nail in the coffin of that sacred vow. He felt like a guardian of a forgotten flame, watching it flicker and dim with each passing day. The bell above a door, once a cheerful chime, now rang with the hollow, defeated sound of a lone customer. Julian would emerge from the back, his apron a shield against the world, and offer his bread with a quiet, almost pleading sincerity. He never spoke of the history, the labor, the love. He just presented the loaf as if its value was self-evident. But to most, it was just bread, nothing more, nothing less. They paid, took their loaf and left, the chime of the bell a final, mournful note echoing in the quiet. Space. His life had become a repetition, a cycle of kneading, rising, baking and waiting for someone to see, for the world to remember. He would look out the window at the construction workers building new towers of glass and steel, and he would feel a deep, visceral pain. They were building the future, while he was desperately trying to hold onto a past that was slipping through his fingers like fine white flour. The more he held on, the more it seemed to vanish. One morning, he found a small notice taped to his door. It was a lease renewal, but the rent was higher, a brutal number that felt like a final blow. He ripped it down, his hands trembling, and stuffed it into the pocket of his apron. It was a deadline, a ticking clock, a clear message that his time was running out. He felt the silent conversation with his grandfather turn into a desperate plea. "I'm trying," he whispered to the old oven, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm trying to keep the promise." But the old oven offered no solace, only a steady, indifferent heat. The bakery was more than just a place of work. It was a mausoleum of memories. The worn wooden counter had marks from his grandfather's knife. The flour-caked air smelled of a lifetime of work and love, and even the cracks in the old brick oven seemed to hold stories he couldn't bear to let go of. He felt trapped inside its walls, a prisoner of his own devotion. Outside, the city pulsed with a relentless modern energy. New coffee shops with minimalist logos and names like The Daily Grind and Brew and Bloom were popping up like weeds, offering everything from artisan lattes to gluten-free muffins. They were loud and vibrant, and their success felt like a personal failure. Julian's solitude was a choice, a defense mechanism against a world he felt no longer understood him. He spent his days in a quiet, lonely rhythm. The only sounds, the scrape of the dough cutter, the soft thud of the loaves, and the distant muffled sounds of the city's relentless progress. He didn't have friends, only a few remaining loyal customers who were as old and stubborn as he was. His phone was for ordering supplies, his emails for bills. His world had shrunk to the four walls of his shop and the ghost of a man he loved. The bakery wasn't just his business, it was his exile. He remembered the days when the shop was a hub of life, filled with the laughter of children and the gossip of neighbors. His grandfather would sit at a small table sharing stories and giving away warm bread to those who couldn't afford it. Julian saw those days in black and white photographs hanging on the wall, faces long gone, a world that was no more. The photos were a testament to a time when people had time, when a good conversation was as important as a good loaf. Now everyone was in a hurry, their faces buried in their phones, their lives lived at a speed he couldn't comprehend. He tried to ignore the subtle shifts, the way his old customers stopped coming as their kids moved away, the way the rent checks were becoming harder to write. He would tell himself it was just a slow week, a quiet month. He would work harder, longer. He would perfect the recipe, add a little more salt, a little less water, convinced that if the bread was just a little better, the world would take notice. His perfectionism, once a source of pride, was now a form of self-punishment, a desperate, futile attempt to control the uncontrollable. His grandfather had taught him that baking was about patience, about trusting the process. "You can't rush the yeast, Julian," he would say, his hands working the dough with a slow, deliberate rhythm. "You can't force it to rise." Julian had learned the lesson well, but now it felt like a curse. The world was in a hurry, and his bread was not. He was stuck in a tempo that was out of sync with everything around him. His life was a slow, melancholic song in a world of frantic, fast-paced music. He thought about selling, about giving up. The thought was a sharp, physical pain in his chest. It would be a betrayal, a final admission of defeat. He imagined the new owners, a chain store maybe, tearing down the old counters, replacing the antique oven with a modern, efficient machine. The thought was unbearable. So he worked, his knuckles white, his shoulders hunched, carrying the weight of his grandfather's memory like a cross. The shop had become an emotional anchor, dragging him down, yet he couldn't bear to cut the rope. The silent plea was becoming a silent scream. Every morning as he opened the doors, he felt a flicker of hope, but every night as he turned the lights off, the hope was gone, replaced by the familiar ache of failure. He was trapped in a cycle of hope and despair, each day a mirror of the last. The future was closing in, and he felt a growing panic. He was losing, and he had no idea how to stop it. The final straw came in the mail. Another letter from his landlord, a polite but firm notice that the rent was increasing again, a number that seemed designed to be impossible. He held the letter in his hand, his eyes scanning the numbers, and a cold dread settled deep in his bones. This wasn't a warning anymore. It was an eviction notice wrapped in a thin veil of civility. The time for waiting, for hoping, was over. Something had to change or everything would be lost. The bell above the door chimed, a sound Julian had come to dread, signaling another disappointment. He emerged from the back, wiping his hands on his apron, and saw not an old man looking for rye bread, but a young man with a small camera slung over his shoulder and an easy smile on his face. He was an anomaly in Julian's world. His name was Alex, a food blogger whose focus was on finding the city's hidden gems. He didn't ask for a bagel or a pre-packaged muffin. He pointed to a simple loaf of his sourdough. "Is that your grandfather's recipe?" he asked. The question hung in the air, a small key turning in a rusty lock. Julian froze. No one had ever asked him that. Customers just bought the bread. They never asked about its story, its origin, its soul. He hesitated, then for the first time in years, he found his voice. He began to talk, a low, hesitant murmur at first, about his grandfather, the old oven, the tradition. Alex didn't just listen. He leaned in, his eyes wide with a genuine, unforced curiosity. He wasn't interested in a quick bite or a trendy photo. He was interested in the human story, the history, the passion. "The best food is never just food," he said. "It's a memory, a legacy." Julian found himself opening up, a dam of pent-up emotion finally breaking. He talked about the promise, the feeling of failing, the crushing weight of the past. Alex didn't offer advice or pity. He just listened, a silent, non-judgmental presence in the quiet shop. Julian felt a strange and foreign sensation. He was being seen. He wasn't just a baker, he was a person with a history, a heart, a story. Alex bought the loaf, but before he left, he asked a question that Julian had never considered. "Do you have any old photos? I'd love to see the man who taught you all this." This simple request, a small gesture, had a huge consequence. Julian spent the evening digging through old boxes in the back of the shop, boxes he hadn't touched in years. He found dusty photo albums, their covers soft with age. As he flipped through the pages, a forgotten world came to life. There was his grandfather, his hands dusted with flour, his eyes sparkling with a joy that Julian had forgotten. There was a young Julian, a small boy with a flowery face, reaching up to knead a small lump of dough. He saw the photos of his grandfather teaching him, guiding his small hands, his face a mask of patient love. He found one picture he had completely forgotten. It was his grandfather, holding a loaf of bread, not with reverence, but with a wide, infectious smile, offering a piece to a little girl who looked up at him with pure, unadulterated joy. It wasn't about the perfect loaf. It was about sharing it. It was about connection. Julian looked at the photo, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of the simple, unburdened joy he had felt as a boy. The guilt that had been a permanent resident in his heart seemed to lift, just for a moment. Julian took the photos and, with a strange sense of purpose, messaged Alex. He didn't use a professional email or a formal tone. He just sent the photos with a short note. "These are for you. They're what started it all." The act was a small step, a breaking of his isolation, a reaching out. It was the first time he had shared a piece of his history with a stranger, a silent plea for someone, anyone, to understand. He didn't expect anything, but a small part of him, a part that had been dormant for a long time, held a desperate, secret hope. That night, Julian went back to the dough, but his hands moved differently. The conversation with his grandfather was no longer a plea for forgiveness. It was a memory, a warm and comforting thought. He remembered the feel of his grandfather's hand on his, the patient guidance. He wasn't just working to keep a promise, he was working to honor a legacy. The dough felt softer, more alive. The quiet of the shop was no longer oppressive. It was a sanctuary once again. He felt a small, powerful shift inside. Alex's blog post went live 2 days later. Julian didn't know about it until he started getting notifications on his old dusty tablet. He saw a headline, "The Silent Soul of the City's Oldest Bakery." He clicked on it, his heart pounding, and began to read. Alex didn't write about the bread's taste. He wrote about Julian's hands, the history behind the recipe, the photos of his grandfather, the quiet dignity of a man fighting to keep a legacy alive. It was a story, not a review. Alex had captured the essence of the shop, the poetry of its existence. The article was a mirror, and for the first time Julian saw his struggle not as a failure, but as a kind of silent heroism. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The next morning, a line formed outside his shop. It wasn't the usual crowd. It was a younger generation with cameras and phones, all of them smiling. They weren't there for a quick bite. They were there for the story. They asked questions Julian had never heard. Before, what's the history behind this counter? How old is this oven? Tell me about your grandfather. Julian, at first, was overwhelmed, a deer in the headlights of a new kind of attention. He stammered, his words coming out in fits and starts, but he began to share. The financial pressure was still there, a constant low hum of anxiety. The new rent was looming, and the sudden influx of customers wasn't enough to magically fix his problems. He had to face a difficult truth. The demand was there, but he couldn't keep up. The old, slow process of his grandfather's bread was wonderful for its art, but it wasn't scalable. He could only make so many loaves a day, and he was quickly selling out, leaving people disappointed and leading to a different kind of stress. He was caught between his dedication to tradition and the needs of a new, unexpected reality. One afternoon, a young woman, a customer who had seen the blog post, asked him a simple question. "Have you ever thought about teaching a class? I'd pay anything to learn this." The question hung in the air, a revolutionary idea. Julian had always seen his craft as something to be preserved, not shared. It was a sacred, private thing, but the idea, once planted, began to take root. He saw the photos of his grandfather again in his mind's eye, not as a symbol of loss, but as a testament to teaching and sharing. He messaged Alex, hesitantly, asking for advice. Alex responded with a simple, powerful message. "Your grandfather's legacy isn't just in the recipe, Julian. It's in the hands that pass it on. Share the story." The words hit him hard. He had been so focused on preserving the thing that he had forgotten to share the reason behind it. His guilt, his grief, his isolation. It had all been a misguided attempt to keep the past alive by hoarding it. He realized that the greatest honor he could pay to his grandfather was to do what his grandfather did. Give away the knowledge, share the joy. Julian decided to hold a small trial baking class. He put up a sign in the window, a simple handwritten notice. The response was immediate. People signed up, eager to learn the old ways. Julian was terrified. He was a baker, a craftsman, not a teacher. The first class was awkward. His hands trembled as he guided a student's hands. But as he began to talk about the history, about his grandfather's stories, about the love and patience required, he found his rhythm. He saw the students' faces, so earnest and attentive. He wasn't just teaching them to bake, he was giving them a piece of his story. The class was a success. He saw the light in their eyes, the same light he had seen in the photos of his grandfather. He felt a profound shift, a release. The bakery was no longer a tomb of his past. It was a living, breathing space, filled with new stories and new life. He was still the guardian of a flame, but now he was sharing the fire, not just holding it in his hands. He was no longer a lone warrior fighting against the tide. He was the leader of a small but growing community. The day the lease renewal was due arrived. Julian had spent the last 2 weeks in a whirlwind of baking, teaching, and connecting with a world he had long shut out. The bakery was filled with a new kind of energy, a warmth that had nothing to do with the old oven. He had earned enough from the classes and the increased sales to make the new rent payment, but the feeling of relief was mixed with a deeper, more profound emotion. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about purpose. As he wrote the check, he felt a knot of guilt untie in his chest. He had made it. The shop was safe. His grandfather's legacy was secure. But a question lingered. What had he been fighting for all this time? Was it for the bread or for the ghost of his grandfather? The answer was painful and liberating. He had been fighting for a memory, an idealized version of a past that he had placed on an impossible pedestal. He had been so scared of losing the memory that he had stopped living in the present. The guilt wasn't about failing the promise, it was about misunderstanding it. He went to the back room, to the box where he had found the photos. He dug through it again, and at the bottom, beneath a layer of old receipts and flour-dusted papers, He found a small handwritten note. It was from his grandfather. It was his handwriting, a little shaky and faded with time. The note was simple. The secret to good bread isn't just the flour or the yeast. It's the love you put into it. And true love isn't about holding on. It's about letting go. Julian read the words, and his hands trembled. The words were a revelation. He had been so focused on holding on to the past that he had choked the life out of his present. He had tried to be his grandfather, but his grandfather's greatest gift wasn't his recipe. It was his ability to share it, to bring people together, to create a community. Julian finally understood. The promise wasn't to preserve the bread in a bottle, but to let it grow, to let it evolve, to let it be part of the world. The guilt he had carried for so long, the crushing weight of his grandfather's honor, dissolved into the air like flour. He went back to the front of the shop. A young couple was waiting, looking at the photos on the wall. "That's him," Julian said, his voice soft but clear. "That's my grandfather. He taught me everything." The couple smiled, and he felt a genuine connection, a bond built on something more than a transaction. He saw the bread on the counter not as a burden, but as a bridge. It was the thing that connected his past to his present, his grandfather's story to his own. He decided on the spot to add a new class, this one for children. He would teach them the simple joy of kneading dough, of watching it rise. He wouldn't be teaching them a recipe. He would be teaching them a memory, a feeling, a connection. He would be doing what his grandfather did. He felt a profound sense of peace. The shop wasn't just a bakery anymore. It was a school. It was a community. It was a living, breathing testament to the power of a story. If this story has already touched you, imagine what's still to come. Subscribe and don't miss the next one. He thought of the new, sterile cafes outside and felt no animosity. They had their place, but he had his. He wasn't competing with them. He was doing something different, something slower, something more meaningful. His bakery wasn't a relic. It was a sanctuary, a place where the past and the present could meet and find a common ground. He had faced his deepest fear, losing his legacy, only to find that his true legacy was never in danger at all. It was inside him, waiting to be shared. The bakery didn't just survive, it blossomed. The baking classes became a regular, sought-after event, drawing in people from all over the city. The old shop, once silent and mournful, now echoed with the laughter of students and the happy clatter of bowls. Julian, who had once been a solitary figure, was now a teacher, a storyteller, a community leader. He still made his grandfather's bread, but now every loaf was imbued with a new purpose, not to be a perfect monument to the past, but to be a story waiting to be told. He saw the change in himself. His shoulders were no longer hunched, and his hands, though still dusted with flour, moved with a newfound lightness. The stubborn rigidity that had defined him was replaced by a quiet flexibility. He was open to new ideas, new people, new ways of being. He had learned that tradition wasn't about standing still, but about carrying forward the most valuable parts of the past and allowing them to evolve. The old bakery was no longer a museum. It was a bridge to the future. One afternoon, Alex came back to the shop. He didn't come to write a new article, but to take a class. He smiled at Julian. "You found it," he said, not referring to the bread, but to the joy on Julian's face. Julian smiled back. "I found out what I was supposed to do all along," he said. He had found his purpose not in perfection, but in connection. He had honored his grandfather not by being a guardian of a static past, but by becoming a living link to a vibrant future. He no longer felt the need to fight the city's gentrification. He saw his shop as a small but powerful anchor, a place of authenticity and soul in a world that was moving too fast. He had stopped trying to convince people of his bread's worth and started sharing its story. And in doing so, he had found his own worth. The bell above the door now chimed, not with a note of defeat, but with the sound of new possibilities, of new connections, of a life being lived with purpose and grace. And promise had been kept, not by holding on, but by finally, truly letting go. If this story moved you, you'll find many others here that might change your day. Join us, subscribe, and be part of this journey.